Welcome to the second episode of SLP Talks. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about the types of teaching styles used, my learning styles, and what I wish I did differently, and what I would do the same. I'll start with the teaching styles Rana used, but I'll go more into depth and label the styles later on. Of course, in the beginning, I needed training. I touched a bit upon this in my last episode, but as a recap, Rana runs a private practice with no other employees, so that means she has quite a bit on her plate pretty much all the time. So she needed to find a system that worked for her. In the past, she used an online binder system on Windows 7 that contained all the patient information, materials, referrals, payments, etc. This was an efficient system until she started to have technical trouble with her computer and it was difficult to access them. So she got a second computer, which was Windows 10. However, the files that were on the old computer were a file called PDF RAC 2. On the new computer, she used regular PDF files. The problem was that she couldn't figure out a way to transfer the PDF RAC 2 files to the other computer because they weren't compatible anymore. After some time and help, she was able to figure them out. In the beginning, I had to become well acquainted with the backstory, the systems, the process, all of that. After that, my job was to convert, download, and transfer those binders, which took about 3 weeks. This was sort of a big and time-consuming project, and it took some time to train me. What Rana did was let me know about this issue from the first time I saw her, which was during my interview. At least then I knew what was ahead of me. Then she explained it in depth more than once. After that, we both tried a trial and error process to find out how to transfer those files. And then once we did that, she showed me again in a more concise way. Finally, I did it in front of her to make sure I was doing it correctly, and that was that. So as I started to understand Rana's process and tasks, I was given different projects. The next major one was observing her and assisting her in sessions. Before the sessions, she would explain what she'll do, what the point of it was, and what the goal is, and what the child is supposed to do. Sometimes she'd even teach me during the session. Although I wasn't doing anything except observing, it was important for me to know what will happen and why. And then when I felt ready, I assisted and eventually led 2 sessions on my own. Having observed the sessions definitely came in handy, so I knew what to expect. But leading a session required more teaching. If and when a child made a mistake, it was up to me to get them back on track. And whenever I needed more instruction or guidance, Rana would give me tips during the session instead of after. It's important to make sure that the client is benefiting as much as possible, which is why it's easier, more efficient, and more beneficial to me and the client if I'm corrected during the session instead of after. And finally, the last type of teaching was me teaching Rana. As I mentioned before, she's busy running her business since it's just her, so she wouldn't have time to create materials for the sessions herself, or she wouldn't have time to learn about Excel or PowerPoint extensively. So those tools were something she asked me about during the interview. So when she would find pockets of time, she'd ask me to teach her. When there was a certain function I didn't know, I'd research it and become well versed in it, and then I'd teach Rana. What this looked like is us sitting together, me taking her through the whole process and showing her step by step, and vocalizing it along the way. And then she'd try it herself. I feel like this is a similar process to how she taught me, so I essentially mirrored it. When I did it for the first time, it seemed like she also understood and responded best this way, so I kept my teaching methods the same as well. Now to go over learning and teaching styles. I'm using An Educator's Guide to Teaching Styles and Learning Styles by Dr. Joseph Lathan from the University of San Diego. I would say I have a mix of the basic learning styles, auditory, visual, reading, and writing. For the more complex ones, I have linguistic, interpersonal, and intrapersonal. Dr. Lathan describes linguistic learning as the sensitivity to the meaning of words, the order among words, and the sound, rhythms, inflections, and meter of words, sometimes called language intelligence. This is not a learning style I utilize regularly, of course, but I found myself using it more because I was in an SLP environment. He describes interpersonal learning as the ability to interact effectively with others, sensitivity to others' moods, feelings, temperaments, and motivations, sometimes called social intelligence. So in my opinion, this is a trait that everyone should aim to have or at least work on if they're working in an environment that requires teamwork and team building. In my case, I really needed to make sure that I had a good grasp on my interpersonal learning as well as my interpersonal skills, because it was such an integral part when dealing with clients, especially children. Lastly, he defines intrapersonal learning as sensitivity to one's own feelings, goals, anxieties, and the capacity to plan and act in light of one's own traits. It's not particular to specific careers, rather it connects the ability of every individual to make consequential decisions for oneself, sometimes called self-intelligence. So similarly to the previous one, I also feel like this is a skill everyone should develop. It can be a challenge finding something you're passionate about, finding something but losing motivation, for example, or dealing with a difficult situation not being to identify or deal with certain emotions. This is applicable not only academically but in the workplace, but also personally. This experience was the perfect time for me to make sure that this is exactly what I wanted to pursue. I needed to keep an open mind, and I needed to find the positives, but also be able to identify potential issues or difficulties in the field to make sure I didn't leave any stone unturned in terms of having the full scope of what it entails to be a speech path. All of these learning styles and skills are something I need to continue working on and developing if I hope to become a successful speech path. Now let's move on to teaching styles. What I found interesting was how Dr. Lathan organized them. He organized them in a range from teacher-centered to student-centered. Going from teacher-centered to student-centered, we have lecturer or authoritative style, demonstrator or coach style, hybrid or blended style, facilitator or activity style, delegator or group style, inquiry-based, and cooperative style. I'll break each one down and talk about if and how it relates to my experience and how it was used or not used. First, I'll define teacher-centered teaching and student-centered teaching. Dr. Lathan defines the teacher-centered approach as the approach to education that positions the teacher as the expert who's in charge of imparting knowledge to his or her students via lectures or direct instructions. In this approach, students are passive actors, or empty vessels, listening and absorbing information. This approach resembles the traditional lecture styles in most university or college classes. In my placement, this was definitely a style that Rana utilized quite a bit, among other ones. It was mainly used during training, explaining a new concept, or when I first started observing sessions. Next, Dr. Lathan describes the student-centered approach as the approach that creates more equanimity between the teacher and the student, with each playing a role in the learning process. In this approach, the teacher is sometimes referred to as the guide on the side. While the teacher still holds authority, he or she is more likely to act as a facilitator, coaching students and assisting them in their learning. This approach champions student choice and facilitates connections among students. Rana used this style the most when I would facilitate sessions and she would be observing. If I needed guidance, help, instruction, or correction, she'd chime in and let me know. Now to dive into the teaching styles. He describes the lecturer or authoritative style as a style that follows the traditional teacher-centered approach, often characterized by lecture sessions or one-way presentations. In this approach, also called the chalk and talk style, students are expected to pay attention, absorb the information, take notes, and ask questions. So similar to the teacher-centered approach, as I mentioned, she used this whenever she was introducing a new concept, new material, or a lengthy project. It followed a lecture style where I pretty much did exactly what Dr. Lathan described. I asked questions when I could, absorbed the information as best I could, and took notes whenever I needed to. The style does have its place in time, but if I could give one suggestion for this, I feel like this style was overused in situations where it did not belong. So I felt like using the style too much could waste time, as it led to over-explaining and even confusion at times, where I feel like a better style would have fit. Moving on to the demonstrator or coach style, it's defined as often used in math, science, and music. The demonstrator style involves more showing rather than telling, with teachers more likely to support the information with examples or experiments, demonstrations, or multimedia presentations. In a placement like mine, this style is super important because the concept of modeling is super important. When appropriate, Rana used this style to show how she wanted something done in a specific manner. But more importantly, she used it to show me how to teach the children. Depending on the session and what the end goal was, each student requires a different teaching approach. So for the child I talked about last time, his goal was to learn how to read. So Rana not only explained it to me, but she took me through it and showed me exactly how to present it to the child. I kind of played the child, and she modeled how it's exactly meant to be delivered. After that is the hybrid or blended style, which is defined as an approach that may integrate elements of the styles discussed above, often blending the teacher's personality and interests with those of the students. While this method is considered inclusive, enabling teachers to tailor their styles to students' needs within the subject matter, some educators believe it risks diluting the learning process by placing less emphasis on in-depth study than when following a single focused approach. The discussion above is not intended to reduce the organic practice of classroom teaching into neat categories or to pigeonhole educators into being characterized as one type of teaching or another, but rather to explore different methodologies to enhance our shared understanding of the teaching experience. What it boils down to is getting to know your students and using your skills and instincts to discover the most effective ways to educate both the individual student and entire classes with your curriculum. What works with one student or group may not work with the next. That's why it's so important for educators to have a strong sense of the range of different student learning styles and a firm grasp of the different teaching styles and strategies you can use to be the most effective educator you can be. In my case, the style was not used at all. However, it was a style that Rana uses with her clients, especially since most of them are kids, such a crucial style to implement in my opinion. SLP involves teaching, but not the regular kind of teaching. The children each have areas of improvement they need to work on, and it's up to Rana to figure out how to best engage with them. Like I said, while the style was not used with me, it is something she talked about. She mentioned how some kids get bored easily, get restless, have autism, ADHD, whatever it may be. So while the material is what they need, the delivery needs to be edited based on the child. In my case, the child I worked with, he wasn't too distracted, but he would get distracted if we stayed on one area for too long. So this was on me to switch up the modes of delivery to keep him engaged and gauge how he learns and understands best. Next up, we have the facilitator or activity style, which is defined as the facilitator teacher is focused on promoting self-learning and helping students develop critical thinking and learning skills. It's a student-centered approach. It involves creating learning plans and classes that require students to explore and discover the course content in creative and original ways. I feel like this wasn't used that much in my placement. I'm not sure if it was because it wasn't one of Rana's teaching styles or just because it didn't have much of a place. The only time it was used when I was given the creative freedom, with certain instructions of course, to design and create materials for the sessions. This was probably the only time this learning style was implemented. It's a style focused on creativity and critical thinking, so I think it would have been super rewarding if the style was implemented more because I would have been able to take away much more from my time in my placement. The next style is the delegator or group style, which is well suited for curriculums that include or emphasize group activities. The delegator style of teaching shifts much of the responsibility for learning onto the students, who are encouraged to work together in projects connected to the lesson themes, think science labs, debates, etc. In this style, the teacher is an active observer working to guide students in the right direction. Again, the style wasn't incorporated much or at all in my placement. As I said for the style before, either Rana didn't use it often or didn't have a place. In this case, I think there was just no place for it. There was another student in my placement, but the tasks we were given did not involve group activities. The sessions themselves were also one-on-one, so there wasn't much room for group activities there either. Not to mention there are certain procedures and rules I have to follow, so I can't really incorporate any group activities. Next up, we have the inquiry-based style, which is student-centered. He defines this as a student-centered learning style that encourages independence, autonomy, and hands-on learning, with students leading the way and receiving guidance from their teachers. For this style, when Rana would teach me, she didn't really use this. However, I used the style when I led the sessions. The way Dr. Lathan describes the style is exactly how the sessions were structured. I would lead the sessions and receive guidance from Rana. The only critique I have for this is I wish Rana used the style more. For all my tasks and projects, I was really given strict rules and guidelines to follow. Apart from my sessions and confidential information, I would have appreciated more independence and autonomy so I could get a really good understanding of what it's like. For this, I was thinking of designing materials for other clients that had different needs than the kid I worked with. A challenge and something new would have been even more rewarding. Although, as I mentioned above, the only time I was really given autonomy when I was designing materials for the sessions. Again, I'm not sure if this is simply because there weren't tasks I could do that gave me flexibility, or if that she just wasn't comfortable or used to this teaching style. The last style is the cooperative style, also a student-centered approach, which is defined as a student-centered approach that focuses on group work and social growth. Much like the inquiry-based style, the cooperative style encourages independence and hands-on learning, but puts special importance on the peer-to-peer work and community. My experience style is exactly the same as the inquiry-based style and the delegator or group activity style. So that's my experience on teaching and learning styles. Now I'm going to move on to what I wish I did differently. The first major thing is I wish I had asked more questions. At times, Rana adopted a lecture-style method of teaching. This is not to say that this style is not conducive to learning or asking questions, but it made it a bit difficult on my end. For example, I felt like at times I was expected to know certain things, whether that be on PowerPoint, organizing files, Excel, etc. So she'd often assume we were on the same page when that wasn't necessarily the case. So I'd ask a question to clarify or repeat, but since there were assumptions, it almost seemed like me asking a question was like a waste of time almost. It was a bit discouraging to ask questions whenever this happened, but if I had made myself clear and asked questions whenever I needed to, I think this would have been resolved much earlier on. With that said, the second major thing is I wished Rana used more SLP jargon and terminology. At the time, I was too focused on doing a good job during the session, so I didn't really pay attention to terminology. It wasn't until my last podcast episode where I realized a lot of the stuff I talked about was covered in my linguistics classes. If I had the knowledge that I have now during my placement, I would have asked Rana to use terminology so I could relate it back to my classes and make connections with class content. So for the last segment of today's episode, I'm going to cover what I'm glad I did and what I wouldn't change. Firstly, I'm satisfied with how I independently led the sessions. This is not to say that there isn't room for improvement, but from the 2 sessions I led, I saw a difference in the little boy's reading skills and comprehension. And second, I'm also glad I went above and beyond in research and learning about PowerPoint and Excel. Rana made it clear that PowerPoint and Excel are resources that she depends on heavily, and likely it would be a strong asset in the future if I'm well versed in them. And although math isn't my strong suit, I'm glad I got to learn how to use the math side of Excel, like how to use simple formulas, because I know I'll need it in the future, based on how much Rana used and depended on it. In those weeks, I learned more about PowerPoint and Excel than I have in my entire life, because of how much I had to use it. I'm glad I went above and beyond when it came to learning about these, because although I didn't utilize everything I learned, I know it'll be useful eventually, whether that be a project or assignment in the future or at a job. Alright, that's it for today. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.